The wind in Providence Gulch had teeth, and it chewed on the silence. It was a high desert wind, dry and sharp, carrying dust that tasted of alkali and regret. It scoured the raw lumber of the false-fronted buildings, peeled paint from the sign of the land office, and whipped the dresses of the few respectable women who hurried along the boardwalk, their faces pinched against the grit and the spectacle. At the center of that spectacle stood a woman. Her name was May, though no one in the Gulch had bothered to learn it. To them she was simply the Chinese woman, the property, the problem. She stood before the assayer's office on a patch of earth hammered hard as iron by wagon wheels and hooves. Her dress was silk, a deep emerald green now dulled by a film of dust, its fine embroidery a mockery in this place of canvas and leather. The sleeves were too thin for the biting wind, and the slippers on her feet were meant for polished floors, not this unforgiving ground. They were torn, and the pale skin of her feet was bare to the cold earth. She had been standing there for an hour, motionless. She was a statue carved from some foreign fragile stone, set down in a land of granite and gristle. The man who had brought her here, a hopeful miner named Elias Vance, had died 2 days prior. Not in a blaze of glory or a hail of bullets, but from a cough that had settled in his lungs and refused to leave, a common and unceremonious end. Now his contract, and by extension the woman it described, had fallen to the man who held all the miner's debts, Mr. Silas Croft. Croft stood on the boardwalk above her, a man built of stout timber and solid arrogance. His suit was black wool, his boots polished to a high shine, and his face was a fleshy mask of ownership. He was not shouting, he did not need to. His voice was a low, confident rumble that carried over the wind. "The contract is clear," he said, addressing the sheriff more than the woman. "Passage, board, and a claim share were posted against her arrival. Vance's debt is now my asset. She is my asset." The sheriff, a man named Calloway, whose spine seemed to be made of wet leather, shifted his weight. He looked at the woman, then at Croft, then at the small crowd of onlookers. Their faces were a collection of dull curiosities, a few showing a flicker of pity, most simple indifference. This was a harsh place, and another's misfortune was just a passing distraction, a story to be told over watered-down whiskey later. "Mr. Croft," Calloway began, his voice thin, "she's a person, not a shovel or a mule." "She is the fulfillment of a debt, Sheriff," Croft corrected him smoothly. "I have a place for her at the saloon. She can work off what's owed." The implication hung in the air, as foul as the smell from the tannery. May did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, hazy line of the mountains, her expression unreadable. Her stillness was her only defiance. It was a profound and powerful thing, this refusal to move, to speak, to acknowledge the men who bartered over her life. It was this stillness that held the crowd, that made the scene more than just another Tuesday afternoon dispute. It was a quiet, desperate battle being fought in the open, and she was losing. Calloway took a step toward her, his hand hovering near her elbow. He was going to make her move. The spectacle was about to end. From the shadows of the livery stable across the street, Abel watched. He had seen the whole thing unfold, a slow, cruel unwinding. He had come to town for salt flour and coffee, a trip he made only 4 times a year. He preferred the silence of his ranch, the company of his own ghosts, to the loud, grasping world of men like Croft. Abel was a man who had been weathered by grief until only the essential parts remained. His face was a map of hard country, his hands thick and calloused, and his eyes, the colour of a winter sky, held a permanent distance. He had buried his wife, Sarah, and his little girl, Lily, 5 years ago when the fever swept through their valley, and in doing so he had buried most of himself. He watched Calloway reach for the woman, and something inside him, a piece he thought long dead and frozen, stirred with a cold, clear anger. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before, the way powerful men treated the world as their personal property. He saw the woman's unbroken dignity, the straight line of her back, and in her utter isolation he recognized a reflection of his own. He was not a man given to impulse. His life was a study in deliberate motion, in conservation of energy and emotion. But he could not stand there and watch this. He could not turn his back, ride out of town, and live with the silence that would follow. He stepped out of the shadows, his boots making a slow, heavy sound on the hard-packed dirt. The crowd parted for him slightly, not out of fear but out of a kind of grudging respect. Abel kept to himself, but he was known as a man who meant what he said and finished what he started. He did not stop in front of Croft or the sheriff. He walked directly to the woman, stopping a few feet before her. For the first time, she lowered her gaze from the mountains and looked at him. Her eyes were dark and deep, and in them he saw not fear, but a profound and fathomless exhaustion. He saw a soul worn down to its very foundation. He did not offer comfort or kindness. He did not know how. The words for such things had long since turned to ash in his mouth. Instead, he made a practical offer, the only kind he understood. "I need a housekeeper," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. The words were for her, but it was Croft who answered, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "That's a touching sentiment, Abel, but she's not for hire. She's an asset." Abel did not look at Croft. He kept his eyes on the woman. He reached into the leather pouch on his belt and pulled out a smaller deerskin bag. It was heavy. He held it out. What was the miner's debt? Croft's eyes narrowed, the amusement replaced by a flicker of avarice. "Passage from San Francisco plus interest. It's a considerable sum." "How much?" Abel's voice was flat. $200 in gold." Croft named a price that was easily 4 times the actual debt. A few people in the crowd murmured. It was an outrageous figure. Without hesitation, Abel tossed the deerskin bag to the sheriff. It landed in Calloway's hands with a solid, satisfying thud. "Weigh it," Abel commanded. Calloway, looking relieved to have a procedure to follow, hurried into the assayer's office. Croft watched, a smug certainty on his face. He did not believe a reclusive rancher like Abel would have that kind of dust. But Abel's claim was on land the old prospectors had missed. A small, rich vein of gold he worked only when he needed to, a secret he guarded more fiercely than his own life. The sheriff came back out, his eyes wide. "It's heavy, Mr. Croft, more than enough." He handed the bag to Croft, who opened it and stared at the coarse, glittering dust inside. The man's greed warred with his humiliation. Abel turned his attention back to May. He gestured with his head toward his wagon, which was parked down the street. "I have work," he said again, his words simple, direct. It was not a plea or a promise. It was a statement of fact. She studied his face, her dark eyes searching for something. She saw no pity, no lust, no charity. She saw only a vast, quiet emptiness that mirrored her own, and within it, a core of something hard and dependable, like bedrock. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. As she took a step to follow him, one of her torn slippers finally gave way, the sole parting from the upper. She stumbled. Before she could fall, Abel's hand shot out, not to catch her, but to steady her elbow. His touch was brief, impersonal, the way a man might steady a fence post. But it was solid. It was real. He released her as soon as she was balanced. He then bent down, picked up the ruined slipper, and tossed it into the back of his wagon with the other supplies. He did not offer his arm. He simply started walking, expecting her to follow. She did. Barefoot now on the cold, sharp ground, she walked with her head held high, her back straight. They walked past the silent townspeople, past the sputtering, furious face of Silas Croft, and did not look back. They loaded the rest of his supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and now a pair of sturdy leather boots, and a thick wool coat he purchased from the general store without a word of consultation. He simply looked at her feet, then at a pair of boots, and nodded to the storekeeper. The journey to his ranch was made in silence. The wagon creaked and groaned, a constant complaint against the rugged trail that climbed from the desert floor into the high, lonely foothills. The sun was a weak, watery eye in the vast, pale sky. The wind never ceased. It whipped May's dark hair across her face and pressed her thin silk dress against her body, revealing how frail she was. She shivered but made no sound. Abel gave her the new coat. She put it on, the rough wool swallowing her small frame. His homestead was nestled in a narrow valley, protected on 3 sides by sheer granite cliffs. It was a place built for defense against the world. The cabin was made of thick, hand-hewn logs chinked tight against the wind. A stone chimney stood sentinel at one end. There was a solid-looking barn, a corral, and not much else. It was a place of profound and deliberate isolation. On a small rise overlooking the cabin, 2 simple wooden crosses stood stark against the sky. Inside, the cabin was one large room. It was starkly clean, but utterly devoid of comfort. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a rough table and 2 chairs stood in the centre, and a stone hearth dominated the far end. The shelves held a few tin plates, a single cup, and neatly stacked provisions. It was less a home than a barracks for a solitary soldier in a long, undeclared war. There was no warmth, no life, only the grim functionality of survival. Abel's grief was not in the room, it was the room itself, in the empty spaces, in the stark order, in the suffocating silence. He gestured toward the cot. "You can sleep there." He took a blanket from a chest and laid it at the foot. He would sleep on the floor by the fire. He expected no reply and received none. A new reality began to form, a routine built of silence and observation. Abel rose before dawn, his movements economical and quiet. He would stoke the fire, put coffee on to boil, and head out to the barn to tend his few cattle and 2 horses. When he returned, the cabin would be different. On the first morning, May had found the broom and swept the floor clean. She had taken his tin plate and cup, washed them, and set them precisely on the table. She found his meagre larder, and using a little flour, water, and salt, had made a small stack of flatbreads which she cooked on a greased skillet over the fire. When he sat down, she placed a plate with 2 of the breads and a piece of salted beef before him. She then retreated to a corner of the cabin and ate her own portion while standing. He ate without comment, but he noticed. The bread was better than anything he had made in 5 years. He noticed the way she moved, with a quiet, fluid grace that seemed out of place in the rough-hewn cabin. Yet she did not seem fragile. There was an efficiency to her work, a deep-seated competence. She was not just enduring, she was creating order from his chaos. Days turned into a week, then 2. The unspoken rhythm of their lives grew deeper. He did the outside work, chopping wood, hunting, mending fences. His world was one of wind, rock, and animal muscle. Her world was the 4 walls of the cabin. She transformed it. She found his sewing kit, a tangled mess of thread and bent needles, and repaired his worn shirts with stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. She took the drab sacking he used for curtains and with a bit of charcoal from the fire, sketched a delicate pattern of vines and birds onto it, a ghost of beauty in the dim light. She began to cook in earnest, using the wild onions and hardy roots she found growing near the stream. His monotonous diet of salted meat and hardtack was replaced by savory stews and roasted game that filled the cabin with aromas he had long forgotten. She was bringing his home back to life, and it unsettled him. These smells, this quiet order belonged to Sarah. He felt like a trespasser in his own memories. They rarely spoke. The gulf of language was too wide, but it was more than that. They were both accustomed to silence, fluent in its nuances. He would leave a brace of rabbits on the porch, she would leave a mended pair of gloves on the table. He bought a small sack of rice on his next trip to a trading post further south, avoiding Providence Gulch. He left it on the shelf without a word. That night, for the first time since she had arrived, she met his eyes across the table and gave a small, formal bow of her head. It was all the thanks he needed. He learned things about her in fragments. He saw her one afternoon by the stream, her hands moving in a series of slow, deliberate motions, a silent dance of memory. He saw her looking up at the 2 crosses on the hill, her expression one of solemn understanding. He began to see that her dignity was not an act, it was the core of her being, a hard, bright thing she had protected through unimaginable trials. He, in turn, remained a mystery to her, a man of rigid habits and deep, unplumbed sorrow. But she saw the way he cared for his animals, his touch gentle and sure. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes when he came in from the cold, an exhaustion that went deeper than physical labor. She saw that his isolation was a fortress he had built around a wound, and she made no attempt to breach its walls. She simply made the fortress a little warmer, a little more bearable. Then the first snow came, not as a gentle dusting, but as a howling blizzard that descended from the mountains without warning. The world outside the cabin disappeared into a churning vortex of white. The wind shrieked like a hungry animal clawing at the logs, and the cold became a physical entity, pressing in from all sides. For 3 days they were prisoners in the small, fire-lit space. The enforced proximity changed the texture of their silence. It was no longer a comfortable distance, but a shared, breathing presence. They worked together to keep the cold at bay, feeding the fire, banking the door with snow, checking on the animals in the barn through short, brutal trips into the storm. In these moments they were a team, moving with an unspoken coordination that felt ancient and natural. Section but, the cold was relentless. It seeped through the chinking, a fine, killing frost that clung to the interior walls. On the 3rd night of the blizzard, the temperature plummeted. Abel woke from a light sleep on the floor to a sudden, unnerving silence. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. A deep, penetrating cold filled the room. He looked over at the cot. May was huddled under the blankets, but she was shivering violently, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He was at her side in an instant. He touched her forehead. It was burning with fever, yet her skin was clammy and cold. Her lips were tinged with blue. He knew the signs. Lung fever. It had taken his Sarah the same way. A raw, primal fear, an emotion he had not felt in years, seized him. He would not lose another person to this cold, silent killer. Not in this cabin. He worked with a desperate, focused energy. He piled logs onto the fire until it roared, driving the oppressive cold back into the corners. He heated water and forced her to drink, spoonful by spoonful. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then lay down on the cot beside her, adding his own body heat to the fight, his arm holding her close in a grip that was both protective and clinical. He held her like this for hours, listening to the rasp of her breathing, feeling the violent tremors that shook her small body, and staring into the dancing flames, his mind a maelstrom of old ghosts and new fears. As he shifted to add more wood to the fire, something cold and metallic slipped from beneath the collar of her tunic and fell against his hand. It was a locket, a small silver oval hanging from a delicate chain. It was tarnished and worn, but he could feel the faint etching of a flower on its surface. He assumed it held a picture of the husband she had lost, the miner Elias Vance. Curiosity, or perhaps a need to understand the woman he was fighting to save, made him pick it up. The clasp was frozen shut. He worked it with his thumbnail, the metal biting into his skin. It finally sprang open, his breath caught in his throat. What he saw inside made his hand go slack, and the locket fell from his fingers, clattering onto the rough wooden floor. It was not a man's portrait. On one side, nestled against faded silk, was a tiny, impossibly intricate paper cutting of a butterfly. On the other, coiled behind a piece of cracked glass, was a lock of fine black hair, tied with a single red thread. It was the lock of hair that undid him. 5 years ago he had held a nearly identical locket in his hand, his Lily's locket. Inside it he had placed a lock of her own blonde hair, tied with a blue thread before he had nailed the lid on her small pine coffin. The sight of this locket, this lock of a child's hair, was a physical blow. It tore through the scar tissue of his grief and struck the raw, living wound beneath. He stared at the fallen object, the firelight glinting on its silver surface, and for a moment he was lost, adrift in a sea of memory so painful he could not breathe. By morning the storm had broken, and so had her fever. She woke, weak but lucid, to find him sitting in a chair by the cot, his face haggard in the pale dawn light. He looked older, as if he had aged a decade in a single night. She saw the locket on the table beside him. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. "My sister," she said, pointing to the locket. She struggled for the English words, her hands filling in the gaps with gestures. "Little sister, gone." She made a motion like a great wave, a sweeping away. "Family, all gone. I come here for her." The story came out in broken pieces, a tale of famine and flood, of a debt that could only be paid by sending a daughter across the ocean. The locket was all she had left of the little sister she had been trying to save. Abel listened, his own silence a heavy weight in the room. When she was finished, he stood up and walked to the small wooden chest at the foot of his own bed. He opened it. The smell of cedar and memories filled the air. He reached inside and pulled out a small, worn rag doll with button eyes and yellow yarn hair. He held it for a moment, his thumb stroking the worn fabric. He turned and held it out for her to see. "My daughter," he said, his voice cracking on the word. "Lily." He did not need gestures. The story was in his eyes, in the deep lines of his face, in the way he held the doll as if it were the most precious and fragile thing in the world. He pointed out the window toward the 2 crosses on the hill. Her and her mother, the fever. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by a strange transaction. They were 2 survivors, 2 lonely souls who had each lost everything, who had come to this isolated place to nurse their wounds in solitude. They had looked into the abyss of each other's grief and recognized it as their own. The thaw came, and with it, the world returned. The snow melted under a strengthening sun, turning the valley into a muddy, hopeful mess. The routine of their lives resumed. But it was different now. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a quiet companionship that was more intimate than words. Abel found himself watching her, noticing the small smile that touched her lips when a bird landed on the windowsill, the fierce concentration in her eyes as she worked. He was beginning to feel again, and it terrified him as much as it gave him hope. This fragile peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Abel was splitting wood when he saw them, 2 riders coming up the trail. One was Silas Croft. The other was a man in a city suit, carrying a leather satchel. Abel set down his axe, his body going still and watchful. He felt May's presence behind him as she came to stand in the cabin doorway. Croft did not dismount. He looked around the homestead with a proprietary air, his lips curled into a sneer. He had not come for the woman, not directly. He had come for the land. "Abel," he called out, his voice slick with false cordiality. "I'm a man who believes in settling accounts. You embarrassed me in town. I don't forget things like that." "State your business, Croft, and get off my land," Abel said, his voice low and even. The man in the suit dismounted and opened his satchel. He produced a sheaf of papers with an important-looking seal. "Mr. Abel, my name is Harrison. I represent the Territorial Water Authority. It has come to our attention through a petition filed by Mr. Croft here that your claim to the water rights for this valley is irregular." Abel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The stream was the lifeblood of his ranch. Without it, the land was worthless. The land was... Harrison continued, his tone apologetic but firm. "Your original filing was based on the old miners' statutes. Those were superseded by the Territorial Act of '78. According to this new survey," he gestured to Croft, "your water access crosses land patented to the Providence Mining Consortium. That is to say, to Mr. Croft. It was a lie, a legal fiction spun from greed, but in this territory a piece of paper from a corrupt official was often more real than the truth." Croft showed his teeth in a smile. "The law is the law, Abel. I am, however, a reasonable man." He looked from Abel to May, who stood watching, her face pale but resolute. "I'm prepared to forget this entire matter. All you have to do is turn over my property, the asset you stole from me, and vacate this land by the end of the week. I'll even forgive the original debt." The ultimatum was clear. Surrender the woman and his home, or be destroyed. It was a choice between ruin and dishonor. 5 years ago, Abel might have chosen ruin. He might have walked away, a ghost disappearing back into the wilderness. But he was not the same man. The emptiness inside him had been filled, slowly, quietly, by the presence of the woman standing in his doorway. She had brought life back to his home and, with it, back to him. He had something to protect again. He looked at Croft, and for the first time in a long time, the cold distance in his eyes was replaced by a burning fire. "No," he said. The word was not loud, but it echoed in the valley as solid and unmovable as the granite cliffs around them. Croft's smile vanished. "You're a fool. I'll see you starved out. I'll own this valley and everything in it." "Get off my land," Abel repeated, his hand resting on the handle of the axe. It was not a threat, but a promise. Croft and his lawyer, seeing the look in Abel's eyes, wheeled their horses around and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and menace hanging in the air. A week later they returned. This time Croft was not smiling. He brought Sheriff Calloway and 2 hard-faced men with rifles cradled in their arms. They rode into the yard and stopped, an invading force. Abel was waiting. He sat on the porch in one of the simple chairs, his own rifle laid across his lap. Not pointed, but ready. He was calm. The fear and turmoil were gone, replaced by a resolute clarity. He knew what he had to do. May did not hide in the cabin. She came out and stood beside his chair, her hands clasped in front of her. She faced them with him, a silent partner in his defiance. "This is your last chance, Abel." Croft snarled. "I have an eviction order signed by the judge. Calloway, serve him." The sheriff dismounted, clutching the paper like a shield. He walked slowly toward the porch, his eyes darting between Abel's rifle and his stony face. "Abel, don't make this difficult. The order is legal." Abel did not look at the paper. He looked at the sheriff, then at Croft, and finally his gaze softened for a moment as he glanced at May. He stood up, setting his rifle aside, but not out of reach. He was not going to win this with violence. He was going to win it with the truth. "This is my home," he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the yard. The words were simple, but they were rooted deep in the earth beneath his feet. He then turned and placed a hand on May's shoulder, a public, definitive gesture of protection. "This woman is my family." The declaration hung in the air, more powerful than any legal document. It changed everything. He had not called her his housekeeper or his charge. He had called her family. In the unforgiving calculus of the frontier, that word had weight. It had sanctity. Calloway stopped in his tracks, the paper trembling in his hand. Even Croft's hired men shifted uncomfortably. To threaten a man's home was one thing. To tear apart his family was another. "That's just sentiment," Croft spat, his face turning purple with rage. "It means nothing. The law is on my side." "Is it, Mr. Croft?" a new voice asked. Riding up the trail was another horse carrying Dr. Finch, the town's physician, and a stern-faced, white-haired man Abel recognized as Circuit Judge Morrison. Dr. Finch, a cynical but decent man who Abel had once helped pull from a carriage wreck, dismounted. "I apologize for the intrusion, Abel, but when Silas Croft started bragging at the saloon about how he'd bought a new land survey, I got curious. I remembered patching up the territorial surveyor last month after he'd had a fall. He got talkative, told me Croft had paid him a handsome sum to predate a document." Judge Morrison swung down from his horse, his eyes like chips of ice. He strode over to Calloway and snatched the eviction order from his hand. He glanced at it, then tore it in two. "This document is fraudulent," the judge declared, his voice booming with authority, "and this court is now in session. Silas Croft, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted bribery of a public official. Sheriff, do your duty." Croft's world collapsed. His power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, evaporated under the harsh light of true authority. Calloway, suddenly eager to be on the right side of the law, stammered and moved to arrest the man he had been serving moments before. Croft and his men were disarmed and led away. their threats and curses fading down the trail. The aftermath was quiet. The judge and the doctor tipped their hats to Abel and May and departed, leaving peace in their wake. The threat was gone. The valley was safe. In the days that followed, the new reality settled in, a quiet, comfortable rhythm of a shared life. The companionship that had been forged in crisis now blossomed in peace. They began to talk more, teaching each other words. He taught her the names of the constellations he had once shown his daughter. She taught him the names of the herbs she used in her cooking, her voice soft and musical. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and rose, they sat together on the porch. The air was cool and clean. Abel reached into his pocket and pulled out her locket. He had spent an evening carefully polishing the silver and mending the delicate clasp. He handed it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. She opened it and looked at the paper butterfly and the lock of hair, her eyes glistening. She closed it and held it tight in her fist, a piece of her past, now secure in her present. Abel cleared his throat. He reached over and took her free hand. Her skin was soft, but her grip was strong. He looked out at the two crosses on the hill, no longer seeing them as monuments to his loss, but as silent witnesses to his rebirth. He did not have the words for poetry or romance. He only had the plain, solid truth. "This is your home now, May," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "If you'll have it." She turned to look at him, and in her dark, beautiful eyes he saw his answer. She did not speak. She simply leaned over and rested her head on his shoulder, her hand still holding his. They sat there for a long time as the stars began to appear. Two solitary figures who had found in each other a harbor from the storm, a new family built on the foundations of the old, a quiet, resilient love blooming in the heart of a harsh and unforgiving land. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.